Hello, my name is Ana Isabel Merez. I will be reading some messages from folks who are currently incarcerated. One morning, I was in my cell, in my bed, under the blankets, minding my own business. All of a sudden, I heard the sound of running boots and keys jiggling. Someone was in a hurry, then whomp! My door flies open, and ISU comes in barking orders for me and my bunkie to get up. Once I complied and was subsequently handcuffed, I was escorted to the hallway where all at once my world changed for the worst. By that I mean I started hearing my loving sister screaming in a tone that to me sounded like terror. "Help me, please. I'm naked. Please stop looking at my body. I'm naked. Somebody help me, please. Please close the door. I'm naked. Help me." These are some of the cries I remember as I stood there helpless, lifeless, incapable of being the man my sister needed to stand up for her at that time of need. My masculinity was paralyzed. I could not help her, so I felt unfit to call myself her brother for real. I was very much present, but I felt I was no use to her. If only I could get out of the handcuffs, I could save her. I could intervene. Yet, as it went down, I failed her. I failed to ameliorate the situation. At that moment, I was less than a man. I went for my annual and I am officially non-binary. I want the protection of SB 132 as well. SB 132 does nothing to protect the basic human rights of people who identify as female. Besides, I like that I can choose what defines me. In October 2018, I was returning from court and I had to be strip searched before being processed back into the institution. I was stripped out completely by a male officer and made to feel very uncomfortable. When I asked why I had to strip out and get completely naked in front of a male officer, I was told that the institution was short-staffed and no female officers were available, and that strip searches were mandatory, and if I didn't comply, I would have to go to ad seg for delaying an officer and threatening the safety of the institution. I complied to stay out of trouble and out of jail. However, I was very, very uncomfortable and didn't like the feeling of being forced into compliance. This is something that happened to me when I was on potty watch in SHU. ISU came to my cell door and asked me to come with them to give them my first morning bowel movement. I never experienced this in my life, and I didn't understand why they were escorting me outside to do this. They took me outside to the SHU recreation yard while inmates were programming. They had me stripped out, take all my clothes off. These people were standing a few feet away. Inmates, male staff. I was humiliated. I felt violated. This traumatized me. I had to tell our female staff to tell the men to turn around. They were just 2 feet away while I was standing there naked, trying to give them my first bowel movement for the morning. I didn't understand how could staff take me outside to do this in the recreation yard, exposed for all to see. I was violated. This has traumatized me. I'm afraid of even talking to anyone about this. It has given me so much grief, anxiety, and restless nights. I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want someone to hear my story and how our staff abuse and violate, degrade us women here in prison. And we are ashamed, afraid to make a complaint, afraid of retaliation or any type of repercussion.
Welcome everyone to our Trauma-Informed LA webinar, Healing Through Activism to End Sexual Assault Behind Bars in the Military. We thank you all for your presence. And as we begin this evening, this afternoon, we always start with a moment to acknowledge the lands and to connect with each other. So as we open this healing space, we acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples who are the rightful owners of these lands that we currently occupy. And we acknowledge the suffering and forced unpaid labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans, which enabled the start of this country. We call in the support and wisdom of our ancestors and ask for their presence with us today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Susie Hess, and I am the co-founder of Trauma-Informed LA. And Trauma-Informed LA, for those of you that are not aware, we're an all-volunteer grassroots organization founded in 2014. And TILA's mission is to foster resilient communities that promote healing and well-being through education, collaboration, and community engagement. So we actually started off in 2014 as 10 social justice activists, and now 2021, we've had over 3,000 people participate, which has been pretty amazing. Please follow Our Stories Matter, which is our podcast, and it celebrates the complex lived experiences of healers and activists, and we focus on their healing through film, art, activism, poetry, and each guest brings a unique story, and one with the global theme of healing and liberation. And as journalist Lauren Gilliger profoundly states, the power of story will save us all.
My name is Fabiola Quijano. I earned my master's degree in social work at University of Southern California last year in 2020. I am a person with an incarceration experience and a founding member of Unchained Scholars. Unchained Scholars is also known as a student caucus of the Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work at USC. Our members are people who are impacted by the criminal justice system and allies. In addition to providing a safe support system, our mission is to dismantle the barriers faced by people impacted by the criminal punishment system. Upholding the values and principles of the social work profession, we challenge beliefs, policies, and systems that marginalize, stigmatize, and dehumanize individuals with criminal records, contributing to a cycle of economic and racialized oppression. Through advocacy and diverse community building, we live the change we want to see. To our knowledge, Unchained Scholars is the only group in a graduate level social work program that represents students who are formerly incarcerated. We are proud to be a part of this important event.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deirdre Wilson. I have experienced incarceration and I'm a survivor of sexual assault. I'm the chairperson of Unchained Scholars until I graduate with my MSW May 19th, when I will transition to be an alumni member of Unchained Scholars. We would like to take a moment to recognize and thank the powerful organizations that have sponsored and supported this event. USC's Relationship and Sexual Violence Prevention Services, RSVP, Pride in Truth, Young Women's Freedom Center, Invisible Combat, Mental Health Connect, DC Rape Crisis Center, and California Coalition for Women Prisoners. Links to more information about each organization are provided in our virtual resource room. That link will be shared in the chat. We also would like to thank Stacy Rojas for their fierce commitment to bringing awareness to the issues of sexual assault within the carceral system, and for coining the hashtag #MeTooBehindBars. It is their advocacy from behind the walls and on the outside that has inspired us to continue forward and create this webinar. We also want to thank all of you for joining us from around the world as we continue to fight for our dignity, safety, and health for all people in these extraordinary times of great pain and unprecedented opportunity. Before we start our program, we want to share a few housekeeping items with you. This event will remain available on Trauma Informed LA's YouTube page for open access to anyone at any time. During the panel discussion, please feel free to use the chat room to express acknowledgement, reactions, and questions. We will monitor the chat for the Q&A period after presentations. We want to maintain a safe space, so please do keep the chat room comments respectful and nonviolent. Also, feel free to use the reactions button to indicate happy faces, hearts, thumbs up, etc. And lastly, as we will be dealing with the subject of sexual assault, we are making support available to anyone who may feel activated or uncomfortable during this panel. If at any moment you would like to speak to a safe person, please type in the chat @TraumaInformedLA SAFE, and we'll guide you to a breakout room to meet with a safe person for support.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Johnston. I'm an MSW intern from USC at Trauma Informed LA, and tonight it is my pleasure to introduce our monitor. So our moderator tonight is Ramona Michonne. She is a compassionate servant leader with over 20 years of experience in public service as a trainer, coach, advocate, and leader. As a doctoral candidate at USC, she channels her passion to develop innovative ways to support vulnerable and marginalized communities. Her current role is grounded in assisting systems and organizations to build community and cross-sector partnerships and to design programs that raise awareness of equity, disproportionality, and disparity from BIPOC children, youth, and families in child welfare. Ramona is a licensed clinical social worker and uses her skills to facilitate community care opportunities. Ramona harnesses her education and experience to promote equity in the Black community. Ramona has lectured and trained on various topics in the areas of child welfare, racial equity, organizational leadership, and trauma. Please help me welcome Ramona Michonne.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I want to take a moment to hold space for those who are not given a moment to breathe fully, those who have lost count on the number of violations and disappointments, those who are all cried out and who can't stop crying. For those who sleep light, ever ready, I'm holding space for your rest and healing. As you know, it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and today we want to bring awareness to the harm that occurs to members of the military and those in jails and prisons. The prevalence of assaults in the military has increased significantly over the years, despite repeated reports. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 12 men will experience sexual assault. Although women report at a higher rate, this issue impacts both men and women. There are higher rates of incidents in the Navy and the Marines compared to the Army and Air Force. Inmate abuse is also a prevalent issue. 22% of women experience inmate-to-inmate sexual assault, and 33% of staff on inmate-to-sexual assault. 24.1% of transgender individuals report being sexually assaulted by another inmate. As you can see, these vulnerable populations are greatly affected by this wicked social issue. And today we want to discuss how we can advocate and navigate systems to address all of these things. So let me introduce tonight's panelists. First, we have Ms. Indira Hanard. She's the executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, which is the oldest rape crisis center in the country. She's been involved in the violence against women movement for over 20 years. Her direct service experience in various gender-based violence programs has helped to inform her policy analysis and has led to coordinating public policy initiatives. Indira, prior to joining the DC Rape Crisis Center, she served as a Senate aide for Senator Barack Obama on Capitol Hill, as well as special assistant on his presidential campaign. Indira was most recently awarded the 2020 Washington, I can't even say this, Washingtonian of the Year Award, and as well as the 2020 Women of Excellence Award presented by the Mayor Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C. Indira also serves on the Department of Defense Committee to look at sexual violence in the military. Next up, we have Kimberly Bailey. Kimberly Bailey is a U.S. Army veteran and a civil rights advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as being a specialist. She's a University of Southern California social work alumni, and she's from Fresno, California. Kimberly has over 10 years experience working with high-risk youth and families, veterans, and trauma-informed crisis work, including military and veteran social advocacy initiatives. As a social worker, she specializes in adverse childhood experiences and community intervention. She has a unique perspective in trauma-informed support and holistic veteran mental health considerations because of her firsthand experiences with the challenges of being a military veteran in mental health. After transitioning from the military, she spent over a year in the county jail and the criminal justice systems, finding herself in a cycle of incarceration, substance abuse, self-medicating behaviors, and a period of homelessness before finding her way to recovery and social work. She currently works as a diversity and inclusion trainer and civil rights officer for the state of California and does volunteer work as a mentor with female veterans and the Veterans Treatment Court. Okay, she runs support groups, advocacy campaigns for her fellow veterans through the mental health and wellness social advocacy grassroots organization Invisible Combat. And last but not least, we have Sydney Rogers, and they have been in the entertainment industry for over 2 decades and identifies as a non-op, non-binary trans femme, bringing more visibility to the trans non-binary community through Artivism, using their art as activism through theater, film, television, and other mediums. They are the training and education manager at Trans Can Work, director of the TG/NB project, board member of Gender Justice Los Angeles, board member of the Los Angeles District Attorney Crime Victims Advocacy Board, and they strongly believe in being trauma-informed and advocates for healing and empowerment for all, particularly with the BIPOC and trans communities. They have sat on and moderated many panels and discussions, organizations such as for Trans Lounge, Everybody Gym, the TG/NB Project, Groove 3, Naval LA, The Wall of Las Memoras, I have all these words I can't even say today, Trans Pride 2016 to 2020, and they'll be starting grad school in the spring to get their Masters of Social Work. with a concentration in trauma and just came out again, this time as a Marvel and Star Wars nerd. Give it up for Sydney. And we're going to go ahead and get this party started. So as you can see, we have a very dynamic panel. And so the first question I have for you all tonight is, can you describe your work to healing and activism around these areas? Who would like to start? Sydney, I see you moving, but you're muted.
Yes. Hi everybody. Sydney Rogers, pronounced they, she. The movement towards healing in my work is it's in so many layers. Before I can help other people heal themselves, I realized I needed to heal myself, right? I needed to really work on myself. I'm 7 years clean and sober. And I realized in especially in social work, there's so many social systems that we've all been victim to. The underlying of patriarchy and white supremacy is still in there. And it's the re-traumatization that I noticed that wears people's souls down, and it wore my soul down too. And I noticed that once I got sober, I needed to really heal some stuff and really see where I can be involved and where I can also thrive. Coming from such a survival mentality, even such as a child, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, the survivor of sexual assault, survivor of violent assault, all those things, of learning how to really navigate where I fit in and where I feel comfortable at too. There's a level of comfortability that I had to really work at. And then as I went into my work, I was able to be this example. I noticed that people would ask me, how did you do it? What did you do? How can I follow? Do you have any? I became a resource.
They're like a prescription, a script.
Yeah,
like,
you become this resource. They see you doing it, and that inspires others. I think that's where a lot of my work started really coming in, social work, of like hooking people up with these. Well, I did it this way. Maybe it'll work for you.
Ms. Hanard, tell us a little bit about your work related to healing and activism.
Yeah, good evening, everyone, or it's evening my time because I'm in Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C., that's right.
Yes, I'm in Washington, D.C. So I think, when I think about my work as it relates to healing and activism, I've been doing sexual violence work for almost 20 years, and my work really centers on looking at sexual violence from the intersections. I am very clear that you cannot effectively do sexual violence work if you are not doing it from the intersections, and that sexual violence work is not a single issue because we don't live single issue lives. And so historically, the sexual violence movement has been a white woman's movement. And Black and brown and BIPOC folks and folks who sit on the margins has historically not been centered. And so whatever space I'm in, I'm always trying to bring those who traditionally sit on the margins into the center. I think as a Black woman who does this work, it means something for communities of color to see other folks of color doing this work. I'm clear that we can't effectively do this work until we do our own work, whatever that work is. And so similar to what Sydney said, folks ask me all the time, how are you still in the game 20 plus years later, right? And healing looks different for everybody, right? Healing is very individualized, right? There is no monolithic way to heal, so to speak, right? I like to say there's no straight path to healing. And so what I tell folks relating to who I am and how I show up in this work is that nobody does it alone. And so I learned very early on that it's important to have a tribe. It's important to have those folks who you're going to go to in the midnight hour. It's important, as I like to say, to have your own personal board of directors, because when you are doing this work for a living and bearing witness and holding space to someone else's trauma while also having your own trauma, whatever that may look like, stuff is going to come up.
Right.
And so for me, it's been very important, particularly this past week. It's been heavy on so many levels, bearing witness to the George Floyd verdict, to the killings of Ma'Khia Bryant. What does that mean for healing and activism for Black and Brown and BIPOC folks, right? When we're dealing with sexual trauma at the intersections, the COVID trauma, the racial trauma, the political trauma. And so how am I also taking a moment to practice the pause, right? And so one of those ways is what I call for myself is a healing buffet, right? And it's a healing buffet, which means that I can pull whatever I may be needing at whatever time, whether that's talking to a girlfriend or burning some sage or some Palo Santo, or I am a woman of faith, listening to some gospel music, like whatever that looks like for me. And I think for me, my work is very much directly connected to not just my own healing, because we're all healing from something, but it's also very much connected to this way of knowing and understanding that in order for me to continue to show up in this work as fully and as authentically as possible, I have to be clear on doing what I am called to do versus what I'm expected to do. And that includes healing as well as activism.
Wow. Wow. I need a buffet. It's a good thing that you're part of my buffet, Indira. Kim, would you like to tell us a little bit about your healing and activism?
Yeah, I mean, both of them said it perfectly. I will really, Indira, thank you for sharing all of that, because I feel like you said everything that I wanted to say and you just said it. It was amazing. That's exactly. But I think what they both said was so important. And me personally, because I'm also, a woman of color, and I'm also military. And so dealing with military sexual trauma, and also the stuff that's happening in society right now, the global pandemic, all the things that are happening just in general with the Me Too movement, and the military Me Too movement. Those are all correlated and intersectioning. So I think she said it perfectly, that also being a sexual trauma survivor myself, we have to take space for ourselves when we're doing healing work and activism work. And Sydney said it perfectly, you have to work on your own healing, either before you start getting into activism work or consecutively while you're doing activism work, because like Indira was saying, healing is not a linear journey. It's very messy sometimes. You can go from feeling safe in the moment to not feeling safe and being triggered, especially in this activism world, especially when you're dealing with military sexual trauma specifically, because a lot of the work I do is activism related to military sexual trauma specifically. And so we know in military sexual trauma, like you said, the numbers are high. We don't have a lot of policy that works right now. And so we have a lot of victims, a lot of people who are non-survivors. We have individuals who are dying every day from sexual violence in the military. A lot of civilians aren't really aware of how many individuals are dying from sexual trauma currently in the military. It became very nationally well known with Vanessa Guillen's case. And then a lot of individuals who kind of were thrown into this activism space without really intentionally being activists, like the Guillen family becoming activists overnight because tragically their sister and their daughter was tragically murdered. And so I think it's definitely something that we have to create space for in terms of healing for ourselves, and a buffet of self-care is very, very important in that case, yes. But
so you kind of kind of spoke to this a little bit, and I'm going to go back to you, Sydney, for a second. But what does it really mean to address sexual assault through activism? You have a lot of activism, panels and things that you've been on, and a lot of different organizations that you belong to, and then you're on the DA's advisory board, Crime Survivors Advisory Board. What does it really mean to address sexual assault through activism?
I think taking the stigma out of being sexually assaulted is key. Being able to speak about it. I think a lot of people are afraid. They'll hear about it, they'll see it on Law and Order or whatever, but they don't really feel it in their bones, and they're afraid to talk about it. I'm all about putting it on the table. We got to put it on the table first. We got to see what we're working with first to see what works and what doesn't. And when people think they have to tiptoe around it, or put how do I put this? It's so hard to activism. There's so many different levels of activism, and a lot of people think, and I used to think activism was only marching in the streets,
Right.
with posters, fists up, that kind of activism. But being an artist as well, I noticed I can tell my story through theater. I can tell my story by being on committees for policy change. I can tell my story in panels. I can use my activism and tell it in so many different ways. And adding that sexual assault aspect of it is where people pay attention. And it's not just, I had sexual assault as an adult and sexual assault as a child, and not being ashamed of what happened. There's such a stigma of shame that goes into it. Well, you must have done something.
Right.
It must have been your fault. What did you do? And I was like, I was a 9-year-old kid. I did nothing wrong. But over the years, I thought I must have had done something wrong for something bad to happen to me. Therefore, I must be a bad person. Therefore, I deserve bad things to happen to me.
It's about shifting that narrative, right?
It's shifting
It's
that.
about shifting that narrative.
Yeah,
And sometimes activism, like you said, through storytelling, when someone else can relate, when you're represented in the story, right? When you hear a story and you see yourself in that story, you're more likely, seek help, or really see that, you're not going to own that negative concept, that negative perception of yourself, and start to see things differently.
And bringing back the humanity to it. I think a lot of people hear about sexual assault victims or survivors, and they think, well, they can't be capable anymore. They're not able to process. They're not able to heal. They're not able to move forward. And it's like, no, actually, I've moved forward even more. I've even
I'm sorry, right?
Yeah, I've conquered even more things because of the sexual assault, because it pushed to me that I got more work to do, and I'm gonna go even further now. Let me show you what.
It's fire you up, right? Kim, exactly. I see you shaking your head. What do you have to say?
Yeah, normalizing those trauma responses. I mean, it's normal to have a traumatic response to any type of trauma, and it's normal to have. And a lot of times with sexual assault survivors, you do internalize those shame and that guilt when it was never yours to hold. And often, especially in the military, when we talk about military, even criminalization, you're criminalized for your trauma responses rather than supported and loved and having that compassion for them instead of criminalizing them, right?
Right. Ms. Hanard?
Yeah, I think when I think about sexual violence and activism, I think about how sexual violence has historically been politicized, right? Bodies, historically, women's bodies have been politicized, and the activism around sexual violence came out of the politics surrounding women's bodies. When I think about activism, I think about it's an action word, right? And so when I think about my activism around sexual violence, I first and foremost think about, so we have to start having the hard conversations. We have to start calling people out, but also bringing them in. Right. We have to have love with accountability, right? And so for me, my work particularly doing this work at the intersections, it's always activism on some level, right? And I think most recently, particularly at the height of the Me Too movement, we have seen all these high profile cases around sexual violence, right? We've seen what happened with Bill Cosby and Epstein, and now we got T.I. and Tiny and all of these folks, right? And so when I think about the activism, it's really about speaking truth to power, right? It's really about disrupting these myths that we see, right? And sad to say, sometimes it starts within communities of color, right? So I've had a lot of conversations. I did a speaking engagement this morning specifically focused on rape in the African American community. And one of the things I said was, we have a reckoning to do amongst us Black folks when it comes to sexual violence, right? And it starts about how we as Black folks really look at sexual violence, how we struggle around the language, how we struggle to name it, right? Examples, Black community is divided over Bill Cosby, right? He's the pudding pop guy and he is Cliff Huxtable and all of this other stuff. They can't separate Cliff Huxtable from Bill Cosby, right? He raped not one, not two, not three, not four, but 60. Right? We saw what happened when it came to other high profile Black folks, right? And so how are we showing up when it comes to really addressing sexual violence, particularly in marginalized communities, right? What does that activism look like when it comes to having accountability within our own? Right.
Oh, I have a follow-up question for you on this. So, you mentioned a lot of the high-profile Epstein and Cosby and a lot of the people that are out there right now, but how do you see that impacting kind of like the awareness of the military and sexual assault in prisons and jails? Like, how do you see that as the political piece of moving that? Because sometimes it's almost like a whirlwind of noise, right? So all this noise about these high profile people, and then you have these very huge vulnerable communities over here within jails and the military. And unless there's it's kind of like child abuse. Like everybody knows about the Gabriel documentary, but all of these kids are abused every single day. Kids are dying every single day. 5 to 8 kids are killed every single day. But we don't hear about that every single day, right? We don't hear about sexual assault in prisons every single day. We don't hear about it in the military every single day, yet we know it occurs every single day. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, with these high profile situations, and you're in Washington, D.C., right? Boots on the ground, working, with the DOD, just not even about that, but just how do you see this being political, and how can we bring more awareness to these vulnerable issues?
Yeah, I think the one good thing about these high profile cases is that it is opening the doors to not just have conversations in additional vulnerable communities like the jails and military, but now folks are starting to take notice and put action behind words, right? And so what we are seeing is that because we've seen an increase in disclosures from survivors at the local and the national level, what I'm seeing and what I like to say is that survivors are the GPS in which we're taking our direction from. So then all these other systems, we are going to begin to put some policies in place, right? And so I think that's what happens when the national kind of conversation can connect with what's happening on the ground, what's happening in these various systems, right? It's getting people to take notice, and that Me Too is showing up everywhere. It's showing up in the doctor's office, the jails, the military, like it's showing up everywhere. And the visibility of these systems is rising to the top as a result of what we see in the high profiler cases.
Sydney.
A lot of these institutions have gone unmonitored. A lot of these institutions have worked on for years. When little stuff like that happened, they would slide it under the rug. That's why a lot of times now, a lot of these statistics aren't even available to us until after the fact, until a death actually does happen that brings it to the surface. There have been more, like you said, there have been way more Gabriels, way more women assaulted and stuff, but they never reported it, because they were never monitored to report it. That's where a lot of the patriarchy and the whole the whole policing of bodies and stuff like that, that these men would say what is actual an assault and what isn't, and what's actual, what needs to be reported and what isn't. And now that it's being burst out to the open, there's a lot of accountability that needs to happen. And the only way to do that, I've noticed from working in policy work, is to create policies in it, having organizations that are not just watchdogs, but creating policy that these people are responsible to have reports that go out and have them verified that they go out, to hold them accountable. That's where the political part of it is with the activism and sexual assault, is to implement laws and bills and laws and policy that goes into the jails, into the military and stuff like that. We thank you for the work that you're doing, but you are missing some blind spots here. And here is where we need to like address these blind spots, because you're doing harm and you're traumatizing people over and over. And we need to bring those blind spots to the barriers in the systems themselves. And that's where there'll be a lot of pushback, because a lot of people didn't have to do that work. They were fine going to work and not
like,
having.
Is it a blind spot though? It's kind of like, you saying, it's like, for instance, people are saying now, like, oh, there's racism? No, like, no way, right? So we pulled the Band-Aid off in this racial reckoning, and it's like, oh my God, there's what? So, assault in the military? What? There's in jail? What are you talking about? People are in jails. So Kim, what do you think about this being political?
Yeah,
I mean, come on. They can't say they don't know anymore, right?
I mean, I think with military sexual trauma, this has been an issue for a very long time. And I think for a lot of sexual trauma survivors in the military, they may feel like they were not heard, that their voices were suppressed by the overlapping Me Too movement, because no one really looked at the military, like Cindy was saying, in terms of sexual trauma happening within the service, because it wasn't being talked about. There was Lavina Johnsons, there were individuals who were being murdered and being covered up by the military, and nobody knew the difference and nobody knew about it because nobody was speaking about it. And just recently, when we had this tragedy of Vanessa Guillen, just last year, 1 year ago, not even that long ago, all of a sudden now it was thrown into the media, and now civilians are like, wait, what? This happened? This is happening? And now it's like this huge Me Too military movement that is happening underneath the umbrella of Me Too, sexual assault. And now people are finally listening to us, it feels like. But I feel like if we don't continue this momentum politically and through activism, it will just be gone, and nobody will continue this movement. So I know a lot of us as military sexual trauma survivors, we feel compelled, we feel pressured to continue this movement as much as we can. I know that our Sisters Keepers movements with Invisible Combat, we do a lot of protest out in the streets, protesting. We do a lot of public service announcements. We're doing a lot of writing on Congress members, a lot of congressional testimonies that we've been doing lately, trying to get this I Am Vanessa Guillen Act passed that will make a little bit of change. Not everything will be changed, but a little bit of change, because there's so many bills that have already been up for discussion that have just not gone anywhere over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And we have not seen any political movement as of yet for safeguards for our military members. I know personally for me, I mean, my whole case in the military was completely mishandled. And that's how you see my whole storyline of being incarcerated, all those things that happened to me was directly because of the mishandling of my case, which went nowhere. I mean, luckily I'm blessed and I have, I'm alive and I'm here to tell my story, here to be a social worker, here to help support other survivors. That's a blessing. But there's so many individuals who did not have that opportunity here to tell their story today. And that's why it's so important for us to have this activism, this movement that we have. And I think the hashtags, the social advocacy campaigns, the Me Too mini, or hashtag Me Too military, all those things that we're doing, the congressional hearings that we're doing, just being the Fort Hood, that situation at Fort Hood, a lot of our veteran organizations, we're standing at that gate saying, no, we're not going to let you be quiet about this. We're not going to let you sweep this under the rug. And because us and the veteran organizations that went out there and protested day and night, the civilians that went out there and said, no, we're not going to let you be quiet. The family members who are like, no, we're not going to let you just murder our family members and get away with it anymore. That sparked political, movement. Hopefully now we will have some policy changes, but it still hasn't happened yet. And we're still going to be reintroducing this bill. Hopefully it will be passed, but we still don't know if it will be passed. That's frustrating.
It is very frustrating. It's almost like you're waiting for a time such as this. This is the perfect storm. This is the time, if anything is going to be done, it's going to be done now. There's so much awareness around sexual assault in the military. My larger concern, and even though I'm a military vet myself, is sexual assault behind bars, because we know that it occurs. And my question to you, Sydney, is when we talk about, this being political and, in regards to activism, how do we raise, awareness around this issue for sexual assault, like the Me Too behind bars? We had Rojas coin that term, but it's not even as well known as we would like it to be. Kind of like the status quo was like, okay, well, people are in jail, and but that doesn't mean they get to be assaulted, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, how do we raise awareness around this topic and create activism within for members that are in jail and in prisons?
Last year in 2020, 44 trans women were killed. The majority of them were Black and Latinx. And that's just the United States. I know there are organizations that meet a lot of women and trans people as they're coming out of prisons and jails, and a way of monitoring if they've been assaulted or not would be to gather that information when they're helping them go out into the world and stuff, gathering that information and the demographics from that way, and then looking at the numbers and looking at the institutions that are doing that. And that's a way of monitoring what's happening and really, and having people on the inside too. A lot of people are afraid. They're afraid of speaking up. They're afraid of retaliation.
That's
they're afraid of all those things, and they see it happening, and they just want to get their paycheck and go home, and not realizing that, or maybe they do. The trauma that's happening is going to leave with that person when they leave out of prison. They might have went into jail and prison. Excuse me. They might have went into jail and prison. Okay, ready to do their time, but then they get assaulted and they leave, and the aftermath of that stays with them, and that's where they can go into a downward spiral. I know when I was in jail and I left, I wasn't assaulted, but I was propositioned. I was almost assaulted. I think I blocked that one out. But leaving out, there's this wave of anguish and loss of going into those systems, and it needs to be monitored in those jails and prisons. And we ain't even talking about the for-profit and the for-profit prisons where they're making money off the backs of all those people that are in there, and then you got adding sexual assault as well on top of that.
So you both spoke, Kim and Sydney, and I know Indira, you have extensive experience dealing with, survivors of sexual assault. But what does it look like? What does healing look like after sexual assault, particularly being not heard, being not seen, as a person who is marginalized and feeling like, again, being blamed pretty much for your own victimization? What is healing? How do you heal from that? Because you both have, flourished in society. And I know that you have seen many stories. So if you guys could comment on that, I really think our audience would be interested in hearing.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, healing is very individualized. And I think, it's a marathon and it's not a sprint, right? And I think what one also has to think about is not just what does healing look like, but for some, it's also what does justice look like, right? And justice looks differently, right? You may not get justice in a courtroom or through law enforcement, right? Folks are looking at restorative forms of justice. Folks are looking at justice in terms of having love with accountability, meaning, you know what? I'm not going to be having Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner with Uncle Johnny, who we say, is frisky, or we can't leave him with the little girls, right? We need to have a conversation. I'm going to call you out, but I'm also going to call you in, right? Because what we also have to realize is, particularly if you are a survivor of multiple victimizations of trauma, if you're a survivor of, let's say, incest or childhood sexual abuse and adult sexual assault, what I'm clear about is childhood sexual abuse is normally the gateway to all other forms of violence, that thinking about what that healing looks like on a multiple victimization level, it is a lot. And so what I encourage people to do is really, one, therapy is not for everyone, right? And there are a lot of people who heal without therapy. And so we have to own that, right? But again, it really goes back into your healing buffet and how are you able to process and reconcile the trauma in your nervous system. We know the body holds trauma in your nervous system, right? And that can be done in a multitude of ways. And, you know, I think what is particularly challenging in this season for our BIPOC folks is that a lot of BIPOC survivors are getting re-traumatized, are getting triggered as a result. We saw it during the insurrection on February 6th. We saw it this past week in the midst of this racial reckoning, right? Because we know that sexual trauma and BIPOC communities and state-sanctioned violence, there is a strong correlation. And so looking at how to reconcile the sexual trauma with the racial healing and all of the other forms of state-sanctioned violence, it is a lot. And so I encourage people to be clear around what their healing needs are, right? Whatever that looks like for you. I think healing in community can be very powerful, right? Being able to bear witness and hold space with other folks who have been where you are where you are, can be very powerful. Seeing the different stages of healing is very powerful. There's something said about being able to speak your truth and stand in your power. But then what we also know is no one owes you their story, right? Because we also know there are a lot of survivors who choose not to disclose, and that's okay, right? That's okay. And so I think, you know, what I encourage survivors to do on a daily basis is be clear and know that this healing journey is an ebb and flow, right? That you're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days. Last week was a whole lot of bad days for a whole bunch of survivors, right? And so what I try to create in my work is a toolbox, right? Again, this healing buffet. So at our center, it doesn't matter if you were sexually assaulted 49 minutes ago, 49 days, or 49 years ago. You can always come back. It doesn't matter if you've been on your journey for 15, 20, or 20 years. You can still come back for what I call a tune-up, right? Because we all need tune-ups on some levels, right? And what a tune-up is to remind you of who you are and the innate resources you have within yourself to heal, right? And to give ourselves grace and compassion that if you slip into some unhealthy coping mechanisms or maladaptive behaviors, it's okay, right? But that if you can come back, right, and get that tune-up so that we can process and work, you know, there's always hope and healing is always possible.
You know, I always tell people, you know, because I'm obviously a non-judgmental social worker, but whatever decision you make at any time, and if it's a maladaptive decision, well, that's at that moment. But the next moment, the next day, the next decision can always be different. And from that moment on, you always have the opportunity to make a different decision. So Kim and Sydney, please tell us about, you know, what does healing look like? And what was the catalyst of change for you to really say, you know what, this is the day that I'm going to make a different decision?
Yeah, I got it, Sydney. First of all, Indira, thank you so much again. Thank you for that. That you're a wealth of information. That was incredibly great and healing. I think that all the information that you gave was incredibly insightful. And I agree with everything that you said 100%. Personally, for me, I think one of the most important things of my healing journey because the military system is so oppressive, right? Especially for survivors who are trying to speak out about what's going on, because we know that UCMJ is not survivor friendly, you know, and most of the time, like she said, justice is probably not going to happen in your case. Not always, but for me personally, I can speak on my situation. I didn't get justice.
Most
It wasn't.
Let's just be honest. Right now,
Yeah.
right?
I just don't want to speak on everybody's situation because it's not the same. Like everyone's situation is different. For my situation, personally, I didn't receive justice. It wasn't going to happen. It never happened. I had to come to terms with that along my healing journey. But so the one thing that after I started healing journey, it took me like 10 years to get to the space that I'm in now, where I was able to start healing. I had to grieve. That was like the biggest thing that I had to do. Was I had to grieve for the loss of myself. I had to grieve for the loss of my career. I had to grieve for the loss of everything that was taken from me during that traumatic situation. That came with, it was like a conjoined thing of accepting, you know, and grieving and accepting that all that stuff was lost. And now I had to find out who I was again in this moment, and what did I enjoy and what do I enjoy now, and who am I after the trauma. And started my USC journey, started my social work journey, and psychoeducation was also incredibly healing for me. Learning that this was normal. These are normal experiences. This trauma impacted my brain, impacted my body. You know, all these things that happened to me were normal experiences. My body was going through traumatic experiences. And like you said, going back and forth. Sometimes I had bad days, sometimes I had good days. That didn't make me a bad person. And it didn't mean that I couldn't come back from those bad days, even when I had bad days. Those were incredibly healing for me. And then starting Invisible Combat, I started that right after I graduated from USC. So back in 2019, it was just an area where I just voiced my story. I was able to share, resonate with other veteran survivors. And I just kind of shared my story in a psychoeducation way that made sense to me. And that was my way of expressing myself. And now in 2021, it started into a nonprofit. I added 2 co-founders. We are working on helping others and supporting other survivors in political advocacy. So that was my healing journey, and that helped me. Like she said, everybody is different in their healing journey, but those are some of the really key concepts in my healing journey, was just acceptance, grieving, and helping others.
I think another thing you mentioned, Kim, that to me really resonated with me is, you know, who are you after the trauma? And I think, you know, if you're listening to yourself, listening to your body, and asking yourself, what story am I telling myself? You know, am I the one being hard on myself, or is it really other people? And I think that that is so important, to really be in tune with how you're feeling and how you feel you're showing up for yourself. You know, I think in this healing journey, I think is critical in moving forward. So Sydney, do you have anything to add to this conversation?
Oh my goodness. Everyone said such good stuff. So good. But what came up when you both were talking was that I was conditioned at a young age to take in trauma and to take in any of that kind of stuff and to push it and suppress it. When Kim said trauma in the body and so forth, I didn't realize how much I was carrying from a 9-year-old kid all the way up, how much I would carry that on. And then I had no one to talk to about how much that affected my relationships, affected how I saw myself, how I saw sex, how I saw work. It affected on all those things. And I love when you said ebb and flow, because I did act out. I did act out horribly. I would do all kinds of things and, you know, overeat and sex and shopping and overwork all the time, you know, all these things. And when I think that the tipping point for me was when I was sleeping on my friend's couch, and she looked at me. I was homeless for 4 years at that time, high on meth, and she said, "You're killing yourself, and I love you, and let's get you some help." And it was the first time someone saw me in pain. She didn't see me as a statistic. She didn't see me as someone who's just taking up space in her house. She saw me as someone in pain. And once that clicked in me, and I went into rehab and started really, I think that's where the healing really started for me. And for really of like, okay, I'm not in charge of what happened to me. but I
Right.
can be in charge of how I'm going to go forward. And I can be in charge of how I want to set up boundaries. And of course, trial and error, of course I had like boundaries for everything. And then I had boundaries for nothing. And then I started finding boundaries that worked for me and only for me. And, and then I went on the spiritual path too. I'm a certified spiritual practitioner where forgiveness was a 3-month module where we learned how to really forgive but not blame, but still hold people accountable. I love when Dare say you hold people accountable still, but I can forgive and move on. That whole forgive and forgive but never forget kind of deal didn't work for me, because then I would just remember it, be traumatized, and then act out all over it again. And therapy worked out really good for me too. I recommend therapy. You're right in there. Therapy doesn't work for everybody, but I knew I needed that extra person to talk some reason to me, because I'll talk myself into all kinds of things. So I needed that therapy. And I still have one where I'm like, now I'm going deeper into stuff, deeper into myself. And I noticed that that's where I've been able to try things and not be afraid to fail. I think the sexual assault that happened to me as a kid made me afraid to try, made me afraid to speak my mind, made me afraid to call other people out for fear of what was going to happen. And I noticed as I've healed more, the more I'm able to call people out with love, call them out and call them in, like Indira said, call them out and call them in, because hurt people hurt people. So they're probably hurting too. That's why they're doing that stuff too. And how do I tackle that? Or I don't have the energy today. I'm going to leave that alone, because I don't have to be the sexual assault spokesperson every day.
So that's amazing. I mean, all of your stories and all of your healing practices are amazing. And I do believe, like Indira said, it's a very unique and individual process, and everything is different for everyone. And you can't really judge anyone's process. And hopefully it's not one of self-harm, but of self-healing. So what are some best practices for you that to avoid re-trauma in doing this work? Because you're in the work, so. Kim.
That's a good one, because I know, and I thought about this question prior to this, because in this line of work in activism, especially when we're talking about military sexual trauma, because we have such an extensive list of sexual trauma survivors in the military, we are going to have instances where we're going to have a lot of victims. And because I'm in this line of work that I'm in, we have a lot of survivors that come to us for support and resources. So there are instances where we do get re-triggered as advocates, because me and my co-founders and a lot of advocates in this space are also survivors of military sexual trauma who may or may not have gotten justice in our situations. So re-trauma is very common in our line of work. So for me, being a social worker as well, we have done a lot of work on countertransference and working on just working through my own trauma and recognizing my own triggers, having safe spaces to speak about those. Me and my co-founders, we do talk a lot about stuff outside of work and how we're feeling and processing and deprocessing and de-stressing. I do have my own therapist that I do talk therapy with when I'm feeling stressed out. Like Indira said, therapy is not for everybody, but it is helpful sometimes when you are an advocate in this space and you are doing activist work, to have somebody, a safe space that you can deprocess during this. And also just having something that you love to do outside of activism work, because like Sydney's saying, doing activism work all the time, every day, constantly can lead to burnout if you're not taking good care of yourself and you don't have good self-care practices and things that you love outside of this, because it can be very re-traumatizing, especially if you're a survivor working in this space.
Thank you, Kim. Sydney?
I value my sleep. I do. I have a trainer right now, and he's telling me, you got to be in bed by 10 o'clock. I'm like, no. He goes, go to bed by 10. Just try it. And I noticed, getting that, turning things off, and just putting on some music. Music's another way I handle being re-traumatized. I love when you said gospel. I'll turn on some soul music. I'll turn on Black women singing jazz, whatever it is. I don't go a day without music. I've noticed how much, and I listen to my body. Listen to my body. That's one of the main things that I've learned to do whenever I'm re-traumatized, is listen to, does my body want to rest? Does my body need to eat? Does my body need to take a long shower? Do I need to go on a walk? Do I need to call someone? I listen to where it is, because I was taught, it doesn't matter what's going on, you keep pushing on. All those mantras we're told, keep pushing on, keep going forward, gotta keep going. And learning how to really slow down. And I don't have to be like everybody else. A part of me wants to be like everybody else, but another part is like, no, you are unique. You are perfect, whole, and complete just as you are. You can handle it how you want to. And so I've really learned to create an incense is a huge thing for me too. I have incense burning right now because I knew we were going to go into this conversation. Got water next to me. All those things, that buffet that you said, I call it a toolbox. A toolbox buffet, however it is. And what's beautiful about the internet and technology is that there's all these apps everywhere that you can download. Instead of being on that Tetris or whatever, get a calm one. Get
That's
stuff
right.
to calm the mind.
Calm.
Yeah, get stuff to calm the mind.
That's right.
All those things too. We have the tools there now more than ever that we can use and bring into our lives.
So, Ms. Hanard, what are some best practices that you would give for people to avoid re-trauma while doing this work, this vicarious secondary trauma? We want to be healers and advocates in this work, but it's tough.
Yep. I think for me, one of the best decisions I ever made in life was becoming a social worker. And it's because when I became a social worker, I really learned what it meant to have self-awareness, right? What it meant to have self-awareness of my nervous system. So for me, it's about putting things in place, knowing that's going to refuel me in an intentional way. So the first thing you see when you walk in my house is I have built an altar, right? And it's an altar that has my sage, my essential oils, my CBD oil, my Palo Santo, all of those things, Bible on the coffee table, right? All of those things, in addition to my gospel music and all of that. But I think going a little bit deeper than that, when I am feeling full, like last week, I have to shut it down. Like I have to literally shut it down. I have to practice the pause, no emails, no work, because some would say, and it's true, I'm a really busy person, right? But what I'm also clear is that being too busy is also a trauma response, because when you're still, that's when the stuff starts coming up, right?
Right.
So I'm very clear on that. And so I think for me, what has been such a blessing in my life is knowing the symptoms and the signs of when I'm getting full, and to reach out for support, whether that's to my tribe, my personal board of directors, therapists, whatever that looks like. And I think it's so, so critical, particularly as a Black woman doing this work. We can get caught up in the mask. We can get caught up in this superwoman motif. And what I am clear about is I don't always get it right. I fall short. And I don't have to be the super saver Black woman in the sexual assault movement, right? And that what we have to be clear about as we are activists in this work is that be clear about when your assignment is complete. Be clear about when it's time to pass the torch and let somebody else take it to another level. We as activists, which is a part of our healing, which is a part of our self-care and being able to and being able to sustain in this work, we should be creating a path, right? We should be laying footprints for those coming behind us so that we can pass the torch, right? Because what tends to happen is that particularly Black and Brown and BIPOC folks, we burn out of this work quicker than our white counterparts, right? Because the activism is personal to us, because most folks who do this work, meaning who does sexual violence work on whatever level you do it on, they're doing it from a personal place, right? This work is personal. They identify as a survivor. You know, sexual violence is personal to them because it happened to someone they loved or whatever that personal is. And so this work is not just work to us, right? This is our calling. This is our story, right? This is what we are fighting for every day. And so the burnout can happen a lot quicker, right? Because we are trying to show up to everything. We're trying to respond to everything. We're trying to go to every march. We're trying to support every person. And right. And while we're doing that, who is supporting us?
Right.
Right. And who is going to hold you, right, when your heart is feeling tender?
Sydney.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I'm part of the California TGI Policy Alliance and part of the Trans Service Providers Network. And one of the things we're trying to incorporate in both of those organizations is a health and wellness subcommittee, where the subcommittee is dedicated to centering on the people who are in the alliance and in the network of taking care of each other. What does that look like? What articles can we give? What poetry can we bring in? What books can we bring in? What kind of other tools in that buffet and toolbox can we give to each other so that burnout, just like Indira just said, doesn't happen? That's a huge thing within all our communities. We're all gung-ho to go in, and people would love to let us burn out. People love to give us all the work and give us
They're waiting. They're waiting for burnout.
Yeah, give us all the work and stuff. But learning how to, like, okay, 6 o'clock, it's time to put the computer down. You know, it's 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, it's time to go eat something. It's 6 o'clock, time to go, take that bubble bath or whatever. And we're trying to incorporate that same kind of care that we're putting out to all these people out there who's taking it all in, to each other as well, and all the service provider network stuff, that we are centering each other and making sure that, hey, how are you doing today? And you sound like you had a bad day. Let's talk about it.
Wow. Well, I did put the last question in the chat, but before we get to that, I'm going to actually go to the questions from the audience so that we can have some time for them to get a little bit of feedback. The first question is, can you speak on navigating through family trauma, and how do you heal generational sexual trauma within families of color? I know, to have to take a breath just to answer that one. Sydney, you want to take a stab at that?
Oh, goodness.
Can you speak on navigating through family trauma, and how do you heal generational sexual trauma within families of color?
There's so many walls that we put up within families, especially when it comes to sexual and generational trauma. And when you become woke, in any kind of form, when you become woke politically, socially, or whatever, all of a sudden, all the other stuff you start seeing all the sexual trauma and the microaggressions and stuff that family members have been doing and stuff. And again, like I said before, hurt people. So they might have been bringing theirs in with them too. But the key, for me at least, was that I can acknowledge it, and I can bring it to the table. I don't bring it up at Thanksgiving. We're going to have this conversation right now at Christmas.
It is at times, right?
At Christmas, we're going to do this all right now on 4th of July holiday and have it all out. No, you learn to find a time and a place and make sure you're grounded. And one thing my therapist told me was, be prepared for the family member to never say, I'm sorry. Be prepared for the other person to never own up, fess up, whatever that you're trying to get them to do. Yeah. Be prepared for that, because if you're expecting it and you don't get it, that's when people go off on the deep end and go on a downward spiral.
But our healing isn't their healing.
Our healing is not their healing.
Our healing is not their healing. And we need to know that what the conversation is for us as part of our healing, but they may not be ready to heal or
not be ready at all.
We can't own that. You know, we can't project that back onto ourselves to say, well, I don't understand. I'm talking to you. So why can't you understand and do what I want you to do? Absolutely. That's a different, they're parallel journeys.
And have support when you're about to approach that.
Oh, absolutely.
Stuff to have people in your posse. I would even say don't live at home when you're doing it, so that way you can leave and go back to, or have a safe place to go to afterwards, so you're not having this hard conversation and then you both go to dinner the next moment.
All right. So I'm going to go on to the next question, because I don't think we need to belabor that question. It says, how do we connect the violence of the systems themselves as part of the policy to identify and monitor individual instances of assault, such as suicide? They gave some context that suicide rate for veterans is 20 to 22 individuals per day. That's pretty high. And I know that is absolutely true. We've experienced several of, extended family members who have committed suicide after leaving the military. So I don't know. What do you guys, Kim, do you have any insight on that one?
Can you repeat the actual question?
Yes.
I agree with that number though too.
How do we connect the violence of the systems themselves as part of the policy to identify and monitor individual instances of assault, such as suicide?
How do we connect? I mean, the violence itself in the military. Well, we know that the
violence of the system of the military itself. Like, how do we hold them accountable for the system resulting in military members coming out of the military wanting to kill themselves?
Yeah, and that's a whole another topic in and of itself, because right now we're addressing the policy of sexual assault. That's mental health, and those are very interconnected. But it's very difficult to hold the military accountable when we are working on this policy specifically right now. But we know that there's so many other policies because they're antiquated. The UCMJ is a very antiquated law. The policies in the military are very antiquated. They need reform across the board. So I know mental health is an incredibly passionate piece of mine, because one of the issues for me personally was mental health. My mental health was terrible when I left the military. Many military sexual trauma survivors leaving the military have complex trauma, combat trauma, military sexual trauma, adverse childhood experiences in the military, holistic trauma, all kinds of different traumas. Then they leave the military, homelessness, incarceration, maladaptive coping, all kinds of re-traumas after they leave the military. So we know all those are interconnected. Then you get into the veteran policy. There's just so many different complex policies that are like impeding on mental health, that's a whole issue in and of itself. And that's what contributes to veteran suicides. So that's a topic that is heavily discussed and debated upon.
Right. A whole other webinar.
Yeah, a whole nother topic. It's very difficult to address.
The other question kind of along the same. Oh yes, it is a little bit hard to hear. Is this the little puppy in the back? The other question, it says, what about bullying in the military? Because I feel that the culture often leads to military sexual trauma. And I absolutely agree with that as well, because there is this overarching kind of like, do as I say, not as I do, right? In the military, I remember even in the Air Force, it's like, this is what you need to do, just do whatever we say. And then when you have a superior coming at you that you think is being a little bit maybe inappropriate, you kind of brush it off. You're afraid to say anything. You think you're going to be retaliated against. And it's like this vicious cycle that can absolutely lead to sexual trauma.
The military culture specifically, especially, I know one of the questions that we didn't even talk about was that toxic masculinity and patriarchy system of the military. It's military culture. We learn really early on, it's the norm. When you come in, it happens at recruitment phase sometimes. Psychological conditioning into basic training just continues on. And we learn that even like this sexual violence, all those things, they become norm, and it's really a conditioning. And then we get like bystander effects. We get all those other things that people just don't speak up about sexual violence because they're afraid of being retaliated against, and it just becomes social conditioning. So bullying is incredibly common in the military. And it's almost like a group think that happens.
It is. They kind of get indoctrinated to that thinking in the military, and sometimes carry it out once they, get out of the military. There's so many different topics we could talk about: military and domestic violence,
exactly.
incarcerated people. I mean, there's just so many things. So before we have about a minute left, so I'm going to ask you guys for just one action step, one really quick. Give me, 10 to 20 seconds. What's one action step that attendees can begin to take to get involved in each of your movements, coalitions, campaigns, etc.? One thing.
Well, for my side, I'm part of the California TGI Policy Alliance, and we had the AB 2218 bill passed that dedicates funds to trans-led organizations, and we're working on the budget right now. And if anyone's interested in supporting for us to get budgeted so that trans people can help trans people in these trans organizations, we would love support on that. So anytime you see any of that on Instagram or on Facebook or any social media, repost. I think the main thing, the number one thing people can do with all of our organizations is to just repost it on your blogs, repost it on your networks, repost it on yours, instead of just going, oh, that's great, and then scroll up, press that copy link, repost it right quick. You've already spread the word on your side as well.
Kim, how can they get involved in the things that you're doing?
Real quick, sorry, Indira. Just real quick. Right now, we are pushing for the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act to be passed. It's supposed to be reintroduced May 10th after the Independent Review Commission completes their investigation on sexual trauma. So you can get involved by writing your congressman, writing your senators. You can always go to our Invisible Combat Instagram, our Facebook, our website to find out more information. We are having national protests actually today. So wow. I'm in California, but on the East Coast, they're happening clear across the nation with our Sisters Keepers. It's a grassroots movement that we are connected with. They're doing a lot of vigils for justice for Vanessa Guillen and all of the fallen soldiers that are not soldiers, but military members in general who have died by military sexual trauma. So they're doing walks and protests across the nation actually tonight. So you can get involved.
Is there a website that information, to know where these walks or protests are? Do they go to our Sisters Keeper? Are they listed there? Or
you can go to our Sisters Keepers on Facebook, and they have the whole events, all the events located. I know us for Invisible Combat, we're having one in New Mexico with one of my co-founders is there. She's hosting one tonight. And I know there was one in Virginia Beach or in Hampton, Virginia this morning. So they're having them random times because East Coast and Pacific time are different times. So they're happening all over the nation tonight. But there's going to be other events that happen. And then, of course, an Invisible Combat, if you want to know what's happening in other organizations that we're connected with, you can always go to our Facebook or Instagram to find out more information.
Thank you. Ms. Hanard.
I think for us, definitely at the DC Rape Crisis Center, feel free to check out our website, which is www.dcrcc.org. And there's a number of ways you can get involved with us, to include following us on social media to keep up with what we're doing. But thank you all so much.
Okay, so before we go, I'll ask you guys for one final insight. We've had an amazing conversation. What is one insight you're taking away with you today?
I'm proud to be doing this work. The more of talking to other people who are doing this work and hearing the passion in everyone in this room, it makes me it just solidifies my choice to go into social work and where I can be of use and of service. It just makes me very humble and very grateful to be able that I've done some healing already, that I can go and help other people. And anywhere I can support any of you in here, I want to be part of your buffet.
I love it. Thank you. Kim, one insight.
Yeah, I second, third, fourth, fifth that. Me too, Sydney. But just our stories, they have a purpose. I mean, all of us, whether or not we experience trauma in our past, I mean, we can go on to have amazing lives and help other people. And, you have a purpose, regardless if you had trauma. And I think too, just after hearing all of our stories and our activism, having self-compassion. Yes, we have good days, we have bad days, but that is the key to healing, is just compassion, having self-compassion, forgiveness for ourselves. Because none of us are perfect, but healing is definitely possible, even after trauma.
Ms. Hanard.
Yeah, I think what I'm taking away is definitely remembering that the greatest tragedy in your life doesn't have to be the greatest highlight of your life, and that healing is possible, and understanding that at the end of the day, in the midst of the victimization, there can be victory. And so it is the honor of a lifetime for me to be doing sexual violence work. It has been such an honor to be in this space with you all. I'm in awe of who you are and what you bring to this work. Know that we are in the vineyards together, right? We are activists together and no one does it alone. And so as we continue to move forward on our individual journeys and on our activism work, my fervent hope is that our chains will connect so that we can continue to create path forwards for folks who are coming behind us. So thank you all.
So though it's a hard process to make sense of all that's happening in our society right now, we know that our society and survival is reliant on the strength and unity of community. As you attempt to navigate the physical and emotional toll of all that is occurring, I encourage you to notice your thoughts and feelings and make sure to express them, to create spaces to heal and check in on one another, to celebrate one another, to stay connected, and to reach out when help is needed. May we all find strength. May we all be well and whole. May we all be free. Good night, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it back over to Wendy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for your time and for joining us this evening and for sharing the space with us. If you missed one of our webinars, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can access them all at one place. We invite you to visit our virtual resource room where we have created for this event. You can visit the room by simply following the link in the chat. And we also welcome you to support our work so that we can continue to have these discussions and share this space with you all. We also have our text to give link, and you can also simply, by texting our stories to 41444, you can support us, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. Please subscribe to our podcast, Our Stories Matter, to listen to more stories of resilience and healing transformation. And be sure to follow us on all of our social media platforms that include Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook to learn more about Trauma Informed LA. Thank you again for your time, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.